Record labels are historically known as hit-making factories. For years, they made their money by developing, creating, investing, and promoting the music that is most sought after by fans. The more music we bought, the more money the record labels made. But leaving the definition of a major record label there today would be like referring to Amazon purely as an online retailer. It's not incorrect, but it doesn't capture what truly drives the business forward. Today, your favorite major record label has more in common with Blackstone than Motown, more in common with KKR than RCA. These record labels are operating more like private equity firms. In fact, these record labels are partnering with private equity firms and other institutions to use their capital and use the record label's resources to invest in the proven back catalogs from artists that have put out music decades ago. The labels are still pushing new music, and if the new music pops, then great. But the new music popping doesn't quite mean what new music popping meant back in the day. And to be clear, this isn't just a, oh, music was better in my day take. No. Sure, most of us fell in love with the music that came out when we were at our coming of age years, but that's not really what's driving this. There's a few big changes that have happened in the business that have led to the record labels changing their strategy. First, streaming flipped the dynamics of how music is monetized on its head. What was once a business that monetized a one-time purchase flipped where now fans pay for access, and that access creates a product where each stream pools into a large bucket which operates like a royalty payment. The best-selling album of all time, by far, is Michael Jackson's Thriller. Over 70 million copies sold worldwide. Most of the monetization for an album like Michael Jackson Thriller had already happened. You had the fans that bought the vinyl and the cassette in the 80s. Some of them may have bought the CD in the 90s. Others may have bought the digital download or the singles in the 2000s on iTunes. But streaming, again, flip the model where every time you want to listen to Michael Jackson Thriller, you want to listen to Want to Be Starting Something, Beat It. It generates payments for the rights holders, and those payments are predictable, reliable, and it's something that investors love. But streaming also breathed a tremendous amount of life into the music that millennials grew up with. Millennials were the early adopters on most of these music streaming platforms. They're the largest demographic of a generation still today that pays for music streaming. And in those early years of streaming in the 2010s, it was the taste of millennials that shaped the direction that a lot of these platforms went in. Apple Music recently celebrated its 10-year anniversary in June 2025. To celebrate, Apple released the top 500 most streamed songs on its platform. Of those 500 songs, 40 of those songs, 8%, feature Drake, either as the lead artist or as the featured artist. In fact, Drake is on 4 songs in the top 10 and 13 songs in the top 50. That's twice as much as any other artist. Sure, part of that may be because of Drake's deal with Apple that he signed where his music was heavily promoted on the platform, but it's not just that. You can't make up 8% of all the most streamed songs that are there. There was a big alignment between Drake himself, the type of people that listen to Drake's music, and how that shaped Apple, and there are similar patterns that you will likely see on other platforms as well. But the more you dig into this data, you realize that there's certain narratives that don't necessarily tell the full story. You might have heard that back catalog is more popular than ever and how back catalog makes up over 73% of all music that is streamed on platforms, and how that is much higher than it was a few years ago. So streaming has breathed new life into the deep catalog of music that's 10 years or older, like Michael Jackson's Thriller. It's done the same for the shallow catalog, which is music that's older than 18 months, but younger than 10 years, for artists like Drake, who has albums like Scorpion and Views that still do extremely well on streaming platforms. But music has done something a bit different on the front lines, 18 months old or less, which has shifted some of the strategy that we've talked about. According to Luminate, in 2024, 49.6% of all streams were from music that came out 2020 or later. People are still listening to the newer frontline music that we're talking about, but the distinction is this. That newer frontline music has a much wider net than it ever had before. The big 3 major record labels account for a much smaller portion of all of those streams compared to the decades that came before that. Plus, the sheer volume of music that's been released in recent years means that a lot of those streams are coming to songs that may blow up in 1 minute and then they move off the next. The microwave era of music. It's hot for a minute and then it cools off. But because of the sheer volume of music that's released, there's still plenty of money to be made, which shifts the power away from the major record labels, who had a much stronger share of that in decades prior, and shifted more to the underlying platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, YouTube, and others who own the underlying platforms that all of that music is streamed and listened to on. Meanwhile, it may be a bit surprising to see all of the interest in deep back catalog, especially since in that same Luminate report, music from the 1980s only accounted for 2.2% of all streams. But the difference is this: that 2.2% is much more concentrated. It's more concentrated in the music that the major record labels already own, and it's also more concentrated in a few select artists like Michael Jackson, like Queen, like Sting and the Police, Rick James, and others that had strong 1980s runs. And that's the kind of music where its consumption patterns are steady, predictable, the decay curves don't show that it's going to fall off completely in 5 years, which cannot be said for the music that's been released since 2020. Arguably, it's a completely different product. A second point that's related to this is that a lot of that newer music, especially in the streaming era in the past decade, has been released by the superstar artists of today, and those superstar artists have more leverage than ever, which means that the underlying recordings for new music from the biggest stars in the world, like Beyonce, Drake, The Weeknd, Ariana Grande, Taylor Swift, Olivia Rodrigo, on, those artists are much more likely to own the underlying music, but license it to the major record labels who can exploit it for a particular time frame. But the revenue that the major record labels get from that music is much smaller. At the height of the CD era in the 90s, the artist that had the most leverage in the game maybe had a 30% royalty rate, while the record label kept the remaining 70%. And again, that's just the superstars. 80-20, 85-15 was much more the norm. Today, those dynamics have completely flipped. These record labels have to offer much more favorable contracts because the artists are the ones that are now owning the underlying master, and the artist is the one that is taking that 70-80% cut, especially for the artists who are generating most of the music that does rise and stay on the charts in the past 5 years or so. I can't overstate just how big of a shift this has been for the business. It reminds me of Verizon and AT&T, and how in the 2000s and even for a couple years there in the early 2010s, they were still getting away with charging us 15 cents for a text message. You only had free calls on nights and weekends, data overages. Those bills used to be crazy. But now we've evolved in this era where it's pretty much, here, damn, 30 bucks, you can get everything you want per month. So again, the new music that does get streamed, it's harder to predict what pops. The stuff that comes out of the gate being the most popular isn't the stuff that the record labels even own themselves long term, because the most popular artists who release that music are much more likely to own the rights and own the music moving forward. And given all of the artists trying to break through all the noise, it's harder than ever for the stars today who do break through to reach the same success as the stars that did before them. The expectation for a superstar artist today is that the ceiling is lower than it's ever been in terms of the heights that they can reach, but the dollar amount of what it takes to get them there is arguably higher than ever. Look at Doechii. She's won Best New Artist at the Grammys. She has hit songs that get radio play and plenty of streams. She's in commercials. People are working and investing resources in making her a star. And her star power has some ceiling. But if we were to compare her career to Nicki Minaj when she was at the same stage 15 years ago, I bet that there were less resources and money that was put into Nicki Minaj, but I'd also argue that Nicki Minaj's ceiling that she had reached and had the potential to reach at the time was higher than where Doechii may be moving forward, which says less about the talent and much more about just how culture has shifted to where it is today. But this has all led to a decline in record labels spend in A&R, the part of the business that historically made a record label what it is. Going out, finding the talent, nurturing and developing that talent to be the type of artist, be the type of complete package that fans wanted to see. There are far less resources that are being put in that part of the business. Warner Music Group has made headlines by saying that they're cutting $300 million in expenses, $170 million of that coming from payroll, and a lot of that payroll being associated with the frontline music that we're talking about. And while some of these dynamics may seem unique to music, there's a moneyball mentality that has taken shape over all areas of entertainment. Major League Baseball used to be known for its farm system. Well, in 2021, the league started cutting dozens of its minor league franchises, approximately 41 as of this recording. The Major League Baseball teams are doing fewer call ups, but when they do call stars up, they're expecting them to be much more developed. They're relying more on analytics to hopefully sign more proven stars and take more of the bets than they may have in the past. Sound familiar? It sounds a lot like what's happening in music. All of this has led the major record labels to double down on what they can own and who they can partner with to try to own more of it. So enter the partnerships with the private equity firms and outside investors. Warner Music Group announced a joint venture with Bain Capital for $1.2 billion to invest in the music catalogs and rights of legendary artists. Sony Music Publishing acquired Hipgnosis Songs Group, which was later rebranded as Recognition Music, and Universal Music Group a few years ago had partnered with Chord Music. There's been more recent deals with Concord, which isn't a major record label, but is a force in the industry, and to call it indie may be underselling just how much influence it has, especially given the $1.7 billion that they've raised for their own asset-backed securitization. Even CSAC, the PRO, which did its own $889 million asset-backed securitization, is an example of this. These companies are borrowing at 5% and then investing at 6 to 7%. These types of deals is like the Kansas City Chiefs locking down Patrick Mahomes for $45 million a year back in 2020. Seemed like an insane number at the time, but 4 or 5 years later, when Dak Prescott's getting $60 million, 33% more per year than Patrick Mahomes was getting, it doesn't seem so crazy. And this is where the business for the major record labels is clearly shifting. Sure, they've used some of their own money, but they're also partnering with firms that have more money than them, but can rely on the expertise and the ability to exploit the underlying music that the record labels have, and using that as one of the strongest backbones for the business moving forward. So where does all of this go? How do we see all this playing out? I'll give you a few predictions. First, I think you'll continue to see more deals like this. Every few years, like a private equity firm or a venture capital firm that raises a new fund, you may see the same dynamic happening here in the music rights space, not just with the majors, but with the indies and other music companies that want to be involved in owning these types of rights. Second, I also think you'll see more investors get involved. To date, it's mostly been the US-based private equity firms, but before long, those sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East are going to start knocking at that door. Remember all of the discussion about sports washing and a lot of the strong opinions about Saudi Arabian money that was entering sports? Well, more of that is probably going to be happening in music as well. These sovereign wealth funds want in on culture. Sports has been a way to do it. We've already seen some happen in music, but I think we'll see more activity happen in this space moving forward. This next one is a wilder prediction, but walk with me on this. It was in the mid 80s when Michael Jackson had acquired a stake in ATV, the publishing company which had owned the Beatles and the music rights to other legendary artists. It was one of those deals that seemed like, oh, this wouldn't happen again. This was just a sign of the sheer amount of leverage and revenue that Michael Jackson had at the time, and he was using this to double down on an opportunity that probably wouldn't exist in the same way. Well, again, look at these artists that we're talking about that have more leverage to do their own thing. What if some of these artists start investing in other artists' catalogs and start getting more involved in the acquisition space? We've seen plenty of artists that have had their own record labels to varying levels of success. Most of them are more vanity projects that don't really go anywhere, but these artists who are building real businesses around what they're doing, how long before they open up their own publishing shop? I probably wouldn't expect to see it from Taylor Swift, especially after all of the talk she's talked about artists empowering and trying to encourage artists to do this themselves. I couldn't see her walking around and acquiring someone else's music from them, but you never know how other artists may act in this type of way. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen there as well. While music streaming itself isn't new, the business is mature. The second order effects of streaming are still taking place, and this is one of the biggest ones. It turned the business into a royalty check. Superstar artists now hold the keys to the business, and the labels themselves are turned into asset managers. They're using other people's money, collecting their maintenance fee like any other private equity firm would, and turning into fee-earning, debt-powered rights aggregators. Will it pay off for them? Their predictable revenue streams say that it should, and they're in a better position to do it than anyone. But to continue using the term record label might become a bit archaic in the future. These companies may be record label in name only.